Good afternoon and welcome to Jewish Women in the Labor Movement. Today's webinar is hosted by the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society. My name is Rachel King. I'm the director of the center and I will be your moderator today. The Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center is a destination for exploring and preserving the history of Jewish families and institutions in New England and beyond. We are an archive, educational center, and family history resource located at New England Historic Genealogical Society, America's founding genealogical organization. Today we are joined by Dr. Judith Rosenbaum, who will be speaking about the important role Jewish women played in the 20th century American labor movement. Before we get started, I just want to make a few notes about our webinar this afternoon. The audience will be muted throughout. If you have any questions during Judith's presentation, please type them into the questions panel to the right of your screen, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. I also want to note that since we are broadcasting remotely, we apologize in advance if there are any technological issues or audible interruptions, like my computer made just now, and we thank you for your patience. Even if we lose the connection or if you miss something on your end, you will have access to the full recording of this session afterward. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Judith Rosenbaum is CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, a national organization that documents Jewish women's stories, elevates their voices, and inspires them to be agents of change. Judith is an active historian, educator, and writer. She has taught and lectured widely on Jewish studies and women's studies, and she publishes regularly in academic and popular journals and blogs, including Tablet, The Forward, HuffPost, and My Jewish Learning. She has contributed to several anthologies, including Gender and Jewish History, Righteous Indignation, A Jewish Call for Justice, and The Women's Passover Companion. As a former colleague of Judith's and a big fan of her and her work, I am especially delighted she's here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Judith Rosenbaum.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm really delighted to be here today and especially to get to speak on this topic, which is near and dear to my heart. So why this topic of Jewish women and labor history? One of the reasons why I love to speak about this topic is that this is one of the very clear places where we can see how Jewish women shaped the American experience. It's not just Jewish history or Jewish women's history. This is really American history that we're talking about here. Of course, not only Jews and not only women influenced the American labor movement, but Jewish women made a particularly large contribution. And this is one of the best cases of Jews shaping American society in a major social change movement. That impact did not happen easily or quickly. It came about because of the skilled leadership of particular Jewish women who I will speak about today, women like Rose Schneiderman, PAULINE NEWMAN, and CLARA LEMLICH, among many others. And so while the story of the labor movement is most definitely a story of collective action, I think it's also good to know some of the names of the leaders and individuals who played particularly prominent roles. Now, the labor movement obviously has a history prior to the 20th century and the immigrant labor movement. Working men had begun to organize themselves into unions of laborers in the 19th century. And by the early 20th century, there were unions of needle trade workers, such as the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the United Cloth Hat and Cap Makers Union, and the Cloak Makers Union, that were all already established in communities where there were many new workers coming in. And these unions played an important role in negotiating pay rates, working hours, and safety conditions for their members with the managers of the companies for which the laborers worked. Women, although they were part of the labor force, were generally not included in the union, and so they didn't benefit from the collective bargaining between unions and managers on behalf of the male workers. Why were they left out of the unions? Basically because the male union leaders mistakenly assumed that women would not be interested in the union because their work, they would only be in the workforce for, at least in the public workforce, for a short amount of time until they were married. And therefore, they assumed that they would not really be committed to improving the workplace long term, since their personal stake in it was short. However, they underestimated women workers' ability to take themselves and their work seriously, and their understanding of the fact that even when they themselves were not in the factories, their lives and livelihood were shaped by the experiences of other members of their families in those same factories. So despite the lack of support from male union leaders, women such as the ones I mentioned before were aware of the benefits and protections that unions offered, and they began to organize themselves. And the community that they were able to build for each other and for their peers was really not only central to their working lives, but was central to their survival and to their success. Now, why focus on the garment industry in talking about Jewish women in the labor movement? In the early 20th century, particularly in northeastern cities, which is where most Jewish immigrants lived at that time, only the exceptional unmarried woman did not operate a sewing machine in a garment factory for part of her young adult life. Often it was easier for girls to get jobs than for their fathers, so they were likely to become workers at a young age. And they worked long hours at extraordinarily low wages in unsanitary and unsafe working conditions and faced continual harassment. You can see from these photos some of the kinds of conditions that they worked in, very crowded, unsanitary. You have to remember that the 40-hour work week did not exist at this time. Garment industry laborers regularly worked 14-hour days, 6 days a week. Hours could be added sort of at whim during peak seasons. There was no minimum wage, there was no overtime pay, and of course girls and women were regularly paid less than men for doing the same jobs. Wages were also deducted for all kinds of things, including coming in late, broken machinery, going to the bathroom without permission, not completing enough work in the time allotted, even when the workers were forced to, keep up a breakneck speed. Workers often had to provide their own machinery and supplies, such as thread. The heat was unbearable in the summer. The shops and factories were freezing cold in the winter. Exits were locked. The noise was overwhelming. Sexual abuse was common, but rarely reported and even more rarely punished. There were no laws to protect children in the workplace. The Department of Labor was only created in 1913, and there was certainly no Occupational Safety and Health Administration to oversee conditions in the workplace. Lighting was poor. So it was really a situation of extreme hardship. But despite these hardships, workers found strength among their peers and in their communities. And many of them also brought to their work and to their experience of being workers and thinking about unionization, some political training and experience. Some of them had already encountered radical political movements in Europe and were therefore already open to ideas like unionization and socialism when they arrived in America. The Jewish girls and women who worked under these conditions also connected some of their experiences, their difficult experiences in the workplace, to the kinds of political oppression that they had experienced in Europe and that often had sparked their immigration. They came to America believing that they would experience greater freedom and better conditions here. And they really believed in the possibility of change in America. So even if they were unhappy with the conditions they found, they believed that they could help bring about the betterment of their conditions through labor activism. Now, they didn't find an easy place there. They, as I said, were not encouraged to be part of the labor movement by male trade union leaders who were hostile often to women. And then also when they turned to other women for support, they found that many of the activists in the women's movement were not workers. They were middle class and upper class women who didn't necessarily understand the experience of workers and also sometimes were anti-Semitic. So they were kind of navigating between different potential allies who didn't necessarily understand them or want their participation. But women brought certain experience and perspective to the labor movement that proved to be very useful. In particular, their understanding of informal neighborhood networks. And I want to start by talking about Pauline Newman as an example of someone who really mastered that particular tool. Pauline Newman was a lifelong labor activist. She had her first organizing success when she was 16, organizing a rent strike. She was someone who was born in Lithuania in 1890 and emigrated here when she was about 10 years old, 9 or 10 years old. She spent her life in the trade union movement. She began working as a 9 or 10-year-old in a hairbrush factory. Then she moved to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where she worked in what was called their kindergarten. They had so many small children working there that they had an area that they called the kindergarten. But she really built her reputation as a leader in the summer of 1907, when she helped organize this rent strike at just 16 years old. She planned it with her friends. It was a hot summer. They had left the city to camp on the Palisades and try to imagine, there they were, so glad to be out of the tenements and thinking about the horror of the conditions that they lived in. And they came up with this idea to organize a rent strike. Now, at this point, Pauline Newman had spent 5 years or so working in a factory. She figured out that the successful organizing model would be to combine women's neighborhood networks and the kinds of networks she had seen at work on the shop floor. And she was able to create the best organized and largest rent strike New York had ever seen. In December 1907, they called for a rent strike with the new year. They went block by block organizing families and managed to organize 10,000 families to withhold their rent on January 1st. They achieved partial success. Their rents were reduced for about 2,000 families, but perhaps even more important than that, the results of that immediate strike, it attracted the attention of Lillian Wald, who ran the Henry Street settlement, and other settlement house leaders, progressive reformers in the city, who began a broader campaign for rent caps at 30% of income. And this became the roots of rent control in New York City. So that was a really important contribution right there. But she also continued to organize garment workers in the shops and helped pave the way for the big garment industry strike, the uprising of the 20,000 in the fall of 1909, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Because of her key role in organizing and sustaining that strike, she was appointed the first female general organizer for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and in that capacity, she toured all around the US from 1909 to 1913 organizing strikes. She worked for the ILGWU for more than 70 years, first as an organizer, then as a labor journalist, then a health educator, and a liaison between the union and government officials. At the same time, she also was involved with the Women's Trade Union League, both in New York and on the national level. This was an organization of progressive middle and upper class women reformers, was founded in 1903, to aid women workers in their organizing. And Pauline Newman and Rose Schneiderman as well, who I'll tell you about in a minute, took on a really important role in helping the Women's Trade Union League figure out how to work with young working women and support them in ways that would be helpful. And Newman was a leader there through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. You can see her in this photo. She's on the top row, she's the one standing in the middle. From the late 1920s on, Pauline Newman also worked for and helped shape new government agencies who were charged with improving labor conditions for women workers. She consulted frequently for New York State on minimum wage and safety codes for women workers. And later, during FDR's presidency and afterwards, she and her partner, Frida Miller, were part of Eleanor Roosevelt's circle of women reformers, and really had an influence on New Deal legislation. And she and her partner also raised a child together, which was unusual at the time, but was very much, their family was very much embraced by their community. So next I want to talk about Rose Schneiderman, who was a close friend and associate of Pauline Newman. They worked together really pretty much their entire lives. Schneiderman was born in Poland in 1882, and her family immigrated in 1890. Her father died soon after, leaving his wife pregnant and with 3 children. And her mother really struggled to support the family, held many jobs, frequently had to put some of her younger children into orphanages because she couldn't feed them. So when Rose was 13, she left school and went to work, first in a department store because her mother really wanted her to have some respectability and felt that for a young woman, a department store was a safer choice. But ultimately, Rose moved to cap making when she was 16 because she saw that she had the opportunity to earn more money that way, and she really felt that she wanted to be able to contribute as much income to the family as she could. It was as a cap maker that she began her union activism. She noticed pretty quickly that the highest paid jobs were, surprise, surprise, reserved for men. And one of her older colleagues, a woman, explained that, well, men belonged to the union and therefore had been able to improve their conditions and their pay. So she went to the United Cloth Hat and Cap Makers Union to request recognition for a new local of trimmers and lining makers, which those were the women's jobs in the cap shop. The official, of course, was skeptical of this idea. He thought this was very silly, didn't think that women would be able to organize women. So he said, fine, you want to organize a local, gather signatures from 25 women at other factories. He, of course, assumed that that would be a no-go and that would be the end of their request, but they were actually able to do so within a few days. And Schneiderman was elected the secretary of their new local. And it was there where she really found her calling, which overrode all of her mother's warnings about the dangers of the shop. And in 1905, the Capmakers Union called for a general strike. Schneiderman was the only woman leader in the union, so she got a lot of press. And because of her work on that strike, really earned lasting respect from some of the male cap makers. It also brought her to the attention of the Women's Trade Union League, which also helped get the strikers favorable publicity. So by March 1905, Schneiderman had been elected to the executive board of the New York Women's Trade Union League and became its vice president in 1906. And she really played an important role in helping the Women's Trade Union League adapt its strategy. And it had started out doing sort of scholarly studies of conditions and then explaining the findings to working women. Rose suggested that maybe instead they should take their lead from working women and respond to requests for aid from those who they were trying to organize, that actually maybe, you know, presenting themselves as people who could meet the needs that that workers knew already they had might be a good place to earn their trust and begin to build bridges. So the WTUL followed Rose's lead and helped women workers who were ignored by the unions, who believed that women weren't, you know, organizable or not real workers or not worth spending resources on. And she was able to cultivate the leadership of women workers by putting them in charge of their own strikes instead of asking them to approach male leaders who wanted to assign other men to run the strikes. One of Rose's, and you can see from this poster, she became a regular speaker and someone who was really seen as a leader of the movement. And in the picture on the bottom right, that's a picture of her with David Dubinsky, who was a labor leader on the right, and Eleanor Roosevelt on the left. So she was also, as you'll hear, part of that circle. One of Schneiderman's other contributions was helping to coin the term and concept of bread and roses. Now, the actual origin of that term is a little bit unclear. There was a poem published by that name by James Oppenheim in December 1911 in The Atlantic. But one of the first uses that we know of in the context of labor is in the context of a speech that Rose gave during a women's suffrage campaign in Ohio in 1912. And what she said was that what the woman who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist. The right to life as the rich woman has the right to life, and the sun and music and art. You have nothing that the humblest worker has not a right to have also. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. Help, you women of privilege, give her the ballot to fight with. And this idea of bread and roses, the idea that workers should be fighting not only for basic survival, but for, you know, the right to beautiful things, for a kind of dignity, for education, for a kind of broader ability to expand their humanity beyond the work that they did every day in the factory. That was something that women helped hone in the labor movement, and it was part of the kind of new idealism and energy that women brought to unionism. So of course they still very much felt that the traditional demands for higher wages and shorter hours and better working conditions were important, but they also tried to recognize other needs. They tried to support women in every aspect of their lives, offering educational programs and subjects such as English and literature and politics, offering social and cultural programs such as dances and concerts, and even opportunities to get out of the city and enjoy vacations in the country at union-run camps. And in the photos that you see here, the bottom photo is a lecture on social psychology that's happening at a camp that brought workers out of the city. And the top photo is from a play that workers put on as part of a club. That's from a little bit later, that's from the 1930s. But you know, this idea that part of what workers could do is learn and be together and have leisure together, and that was all part of the things that workers needed. Rose worked, like Pauline Newman, she worked she was very loyal and devoted, and she worked for the Women's Trade Union League and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union for many, many years, though not always easily. There were often frustrations around anti-Semitism and sexism and ambivalence about cross-class alliances. Schneiderman also played a key role in the New York State suffrage campaign, again, a movement that was led by middle-class women, but working-class women understood pretty quickly that they would be able to get a lot more done in terms of changing conditions if they had the vote. And so they really pragmatically used suffrage as, saw it as a tool for strengthening the labor movement. In 1920, she ran for the U.S. Senate. It actually ran for the U.S. Senate on the Labor Party ticket. She didn't win, but her campaign brought attention to the needs of working people. In later years, she was very close with the Roosevelts. She was the only woman on FDR's National Recovery Administration Labor Advisory Board, and she played a key role in shaping some of the landmark legislation of the New Deal. And she also really helped make New York State a kind of national laboratory for labor and social welfare legislation. First as a lobbyist for the Women's Trade Union League from 1911 to 1932, and then as the New York Secretary of Labor from 1937 to 1943. And of course, she was involved in many other causes. She supported refugees from Europe. When the State of Israel was, being born, she was an active supporter of that as well. So she led a very engaged life throughout. Another person who was sort of part of that same community of Rose Schneiderman and Pauline Newman was Clara LEMLICH. And I want to say again that these women worked together, they knew each other, and their friendship was particularly important because they were working with so many men who really kind of dismissed them and didn't take them very seriously. And so they worked side by side in factories when they were young. They worked side by side, they walked side by side on picket lines. But then throughout their careers, they continued to support each other even when they were doing different kinds of work within the movement. LEMLICH was born in Ukraine in 1886, came to the United States in 1903. She came sort of pre-radicalized. She'd been introduced to revolutionary ideas by a neighbor who shared political pamphlets with her when she was growing up, and she was very eager to be educated in a secular way, which wasn't really possible where she lived, and so those pamphlets helped her develop her skills. She began working at age 12 as a seamstress in Ukraine, and by 16 she was a dressmaker in New York. Immediately infuriated by the poor conditions, she began organizing women into the new International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And like Schneiderman and Newman, the male workers who dominated the union sort of blew her off and resisted her efforts, but she warned them that really their union would not be able to get off the ground the way they wanted it to until they included women. So over the men's objections, she kept bringing her female co-workers out on strike again and again between 1907 and 1909, and that helped build up the basis for what would become this giant garment worker strike in 1909. So in 1909, as this strike is brewing, LEMLICH is on the executive board of ILGWU Local 25. She'd been organizing small shops for the past 3 years. She'd asked Rose Schneiderman for help to organize the shirtwaist makers, and she was really hammering home this point that to the older male leaders that they would lose if they kept striking without organizing the shop's women. So she kept doing that work. And when the strikes began in September 1909, she was out there every day. She was arrested 17 times and had 6 ribs broken. And at that point, this wasn't a general strike. This was a series of strikes that were popping up as individual strikes in all these different shops. The ILGWU decided to hold a general meeting in November to think about whether they should call a general strike, but how they could bring all of this energy together. And at that meeting at Cooper Union on November 22nd, the hall was packed, and all of these leaders came up to speak. Samuel Gompers, Leonora O'Reilly of the Women's Trade Union League, Benjamin Feigenbaum of the Jewish Daily Forward, and they all spoke and they addressed the terrible conditions, but they did not offer any concrete solutions. And here are all these workers standing there, listening, getting frustrated, and LEMLICH was among them, and she just felt like no one is moving this forward. And so she jumped up onto the stage and she gave this rousing speech in which she expressed frustration with the kind of speechifying that was happening, and she called on everyone to declare a general strike and to take an oath and that they would go out on strike. And her speech sparked the uprising of the 20,000 shirtwaist makers strike, which was the largest strike of women to that time. It overnight between 20,000 and 40,000 workers, most of them teenage girls, most of them Jewish, walked off their jobs in protest of low wages and long hours and dangerous conditions. And this strike spread to industrial cities from New York through the Midwest. Now, again, often, and the term, the uprising of the 20,000, sounds like it was some kind of like spontaneous uprising, but the truth is it was based on 3 years of focused organizing. And it is likely when Clara LEMLICH got up there on that stage, even though she was not on the program, it is likely that many, many people knew who she was and were very glad to see her there. So, there was a strong foundation to this strike that had been laid by women like Clara LEMLICH and Rose Schneiderman and Pauline Newman over the years. But the ability to sustain the strike was helped by women in the Socialist Party, by the Women's Trade Union League, by upper class women who came out on the lines. And you can see in the picture on the bottom there, you see in the middle, Fola La Follette, who was a upper class reformer. You can see her there with her fur muff. The bosses very much were trying to divide workers. They tried to divide them by ethnic group. They hired prostitutes to infiltrate the picket lines to sully the strikers' reputations. They hired thugs to beat strikers, and then the police would arrest the strikers for being disruptive. And the upper class women in organizations like the Women's Trade Union League organized what they called mink brigades that brought wealthy women and college students onto the picket line, which helped restrain the police. The police were much less likely to beat or arrest somebody who had some social standing and some money and could get them in trouble. So the wealthy women's presence not only protected the strikers, but also helped generate money and press for them. And in return, it helped the suffragist cause because many of the women were suffragists and were appreciative of being able to have this opportunity to build alliance with workers and to get some press themselves. It also, of course, highlighted the limits of sisterhood because it made working class women very aware of how far they were from the protected status of the affluent women who were coming out to help them. So the uprising of the 20,000 lasted for 11 weeks. It is still the largest strike of women workers in history. The strikers won a portion of their demands. They won a 52-hour week, at least 4 holidays with pay per year, no discrimination against union loyalists, equal division of work during slack seasons, the ability to negotiate wages with their employees, a few other things. But in some ways, what's more important is that it sparked 5 years of revolt that really transformed the garment industry into one of the best organized trades in the US. By the end of the strike, 85% of all shirtwaist makers in New York had joined the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And Local 25, which began the strike with 100 members, now counted 10,000. So it has really grown the movement. And less tangible, but I would say equally important, is that the general strike convinced male leaders to accept women as capable union activists. They really proved their mettle to the union leaders and to themselves. The young women, through this incredibly exhausting and demanding and physically taxing strike, also discovered their own self-worth and their own sense of having a cause that they were devoted to. Now, I want to get back to this idea of bread and roses because the women workers who were part of this strike really helped unpack this idea a little bit. And I want to go back to Clara LEMLICH, who in an article in November of 1909, explaining why more than 20,000 women had gone out on strike, gave this as an explanation when the reporter said, like, what is this about? She said, sometimes a girl has a new hat. It's never very much to look at because it never costs more than 50 cents, but it's pretty sure to be spoiled after it's been at the shop. There are no dressing rooms for the girls in the shops, no place to hang a hat where it will not be spoiled by the end of the day. We're human, all of us girls, and we're young. We like new hats as well as any other young women. Why shouldn't we? And if one of us gets a new one, even if it hasn't cost more than 50 cents, that means that we have gone for weeks on 2-cent lunches, dry cakes, and nothing else. Now you can imagine, and here I put these pictures here of these women in their hats so you can get a sense of, these hats are really quite enormous and special and very much part of these young working women's sense of style and sense of self, and something which, as LEMLICH explains, they really starved themselves for, to have these hats that made them more American, that made them, you know, look au courant. And it was something that the male union leaders couldn't understand. When they read this article with this quote from LEMLICH, they thought this was absurd. They just said, "You're making this sound totally frivolous. This isn't about hats." And she said, "What you don't understand is that this is an important thing, to be able to, for women to feel like they can go to work and they know that this thing that they've invested in, that makes them feel beautiful, that makes them feel like a person, isn't going to be physically crushed," right? That this isn't, you know, a symbol. This is like actually crushing the hat, that is important to women feeling like they can walk out of their very grueling, demanding day at the factory and feel still like a human being. So it was really part of redefining what matters and bringing these questions of sort of full humanity and dignity to the table, not just issues of survival. For Clara LEMLICH, her career path shifted after the uprising of the 20,000 because she was actually blacklisted from New York garment shops because of her activism at that time. So she turned her energies to the suffrage movement. She helped found the Wage Earners League for Women's Suffrage, but she was eventually fired from her position as an organizer because she refused to moderate her radical politics to fit the more conservative vision of most middle-class suffragists. In 1913, she got married to a printer named Joe Shabelson, and the couple had 3 children. And then Clara brought her organizing skills and economic analysis to the domestic realm, and she began to organize wives and mothers around issues such as housing, food, and public education. She was a leader of the kosher meat boycotts of 1917. She protested rapid price increases, and she was a leader in the rent strike movement that swept New York City in 1919 when a post-war housing shortage raised the cost of decent housing. In the 1920s, Clara joined the Communist Party, and she helped to found the United Council of Working Class Housewives, which helped the wives of striking workers raise funds and gather food and set up community kitchens and cooperative childcare. She made the argument that working class housewives were just as important as participants in the class struggle as their wage earning relatives, and that the movement really needed to think about workers not just as the people who were in the factories, but the people who were managing the domestic economy as well. She continued to do this work. The United Council of Working Class Housewives changed its name to the Progressive Women's Councils and began building a coalition of a wide range of women's organizations to protest the costs of food and housing. Clara Shabelson served as its president and had quite a bit of success in that role. In 1944, after her husband became ill, Clara LEMLICH Shabelson, who was now 58, returned to the garment trade and to the union movement. And during the 1940s, she served on the American Committee to Survey Trade Union Conditions in Europe. She spoke out against nuclear weapons as an organizer for the American League Against War and Fascism. And she continued to be an activist. A lot of people had no idea at that point that she was the same Clara LEMLICH who had sparked the uprising of the 20,000. She just kind of did her work, kept her head down. But she was a lifelong activist. And at age 81, when she went to go live in the Jewish Home for the Aged in Los Angeles, she persuaded the administrators there to honor the grape and lettuce boycott that was being promoted by the United Farm Workers. And she helped the orderlies there organize a union. She died in 1982 at age 96. So, you know, we see that example, which we see also echoed in Pauline Newman's life and in Rose Schneiderman's life, of this kind of lifelong thread of activism through different kinds of efforts, but that relied on similar approaches. So I want to go back a little bit to another important turning point in the labor movement, which was the Triangle Factory fire on Saturday, March 25th, 1911. The fire broke out near the end of a workday. It broke out in the factory near the top, the second to top floor, and spread quickly. And although the owners of the company, who were themselves Jewish, had been cited several times for violation of the city's fire safety code, they had simply paid the fine and continued operating without fixing the issues that had triggered the safety code in the first place. So on the day of the fire, there were about 500 workers present in the factory. Most of the exits were locked in order to prevent theft and to keep out union organizers. And the fire engine ladders were not tall enough to reach the top floors of the building on which the workers were trapped. And when the workers jumped, the blankets and nets that were held by bystanders just simply collapsed under their weight. So you can see in that picture on the left, you can see the ladders which don't reach up far enough. And I didn't include these pictures because they're quite gruesome, but there are photos of the street just lined with broken bodies of people who had jumped out rather than burned to death in the factory. The factory was utterly destroyed. 146 people lost their lives. Most of them were Jewish immigrant women between the ages of 16 and 23. So the scale of the tragedy provoked, as you might imagine, widespread grief and outrage, and was really a turning point for so many workers and activists at the time. And I want to read to you a little bit just to give you a sense of this. Rose Schneiderman gave a speech on April 2nd at the Metropolitan Opera House, which was a gathering to protest the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And this, remember, is Rose Schneiderman, who had been working with the Women's Trade Union League at that point for almost 10 years. She was one of the workers who was kind of best known for working on, across class with upper class women. And she says in this talk, I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you, good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. The old Inquisition had its rack and its thumbscrews and its instruments of torture with iron teeth. We know what these things are today. The iron teeth are our necessities. The thumbscrews are the high-powered and swift machinery close to which we must work. And the rack is here in the fire trap structures that will destroy us the minute they catch fire. And she went on, but she ended by saying, I can't talk fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience it is up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working class movement. So, it gives you a sense of her absolute despair and frustration that the folks she had been working with all this time, she's realizing just aren't willing to do enough. And she's beginning to think that really working across class is going to be futile, and she really has to help build the working class movement. But the fire galvanized all sorts of people into action, both within the Jewish community and beyond, and the progressive community as well. And in the wake of public protest, the New York State Commission on Safety was established. And among its participants were many forerunners of the New Deal, including Frances Perkins, who witnessed the fire. She became, of course, the first female member of the cabinet. She was in FDR's cabinet. But she was sitting, it was a Saturday, she was sitting having tea in Washington Square, and the Triangle Factory was just a couple blocks away. And so she saw the fire and was really changed by it. Following the committee's recommendations, the New York State Legislature set up a factory investigating commission, which looked at the working conditions in the shops and in factories and in tenement houses, and was really instrumental in drafting new legislation. The trial of the factory owners resulted in acquittal. And after collecting their insurance, they soon reopened their shop at a new address and offered to pay 1 week's wages to the families of the victims. But really in the centuries since the Triangle Fire, it has remained a focus for labor activity. And you can see here some of the coverage in the papers. On the left is the Oklahoma State Capitol, so where it's on the front page, you get a sense that this was a very major issue that got national attention, and of course dominated the Yiddish papers, which really saw this as an utter destruction, on the just something that was really hard to wrap their minds around. I mean, so many people in the immigrant community had at some point worked there or knew someone who worked there. It was just devastating. The tragedy is still commemorated by annual demonstrations, by gathering of workers and union events, and it's considered the worst disaster in New York City until the destruction of the World Trade Center on September 11th. And you can just see in these photos of the funeral that thousands came out into the streets and marched, and it was really a giant galvanizing effort that captured people's imaginations and really spurred them to a new kind of organizing around working conditions. Now, I know I've been talking mostly about events and people in New York, but this is not just a New York-centered story or movement. So I want to tell you about a few other people who played important roles that give you a little bit of a different sense. So this is BESSIE ABRAMOWITZ, who was born in 1889 in Russia. She was one of 10 children, and she came to the US in 1905 to avoid marriage, an arranged marriage. That was the story for many people. She arrived in Chicago, where she had some distant relatives, and she, at age 15, found a job as a button sewer in a garment factory, and also enrolled in night school at Hull House, one of the local settlement houses that served the immigrant community. When she organized a shop committee to protest working conditions and their pay of $3 for a 60-hour week, she was promptly fired. And when she went to look for other work, she found herself on an employer's blacklist and was finally forced to take a job under an assumed name. And that really, you know, she kept working, but she was underneath, she was boiling. And a few years later, in September of 1910, she fought back again, this time against a pay cut. And she organized a walkout of 16 young women in their factory, which was at first viewed with sort of amusement by most other workers in the plant. But the young women persisted and they gained followers. And by mid-October, most of the 8,000 workers at the Hart, Schaffner, and Marx firm were out on strike, soon joined by thousands in other plants. A young man named Sidney Hillman, who had been among those who first laughed at the walkout, followed the lead of the young women and joined the strikes 3 weeks after it began, and soon emerged as a strike leader. And Sidney and Bessie's friendship soon blossomed into romance, and they got engaged in 1914. The strike won the support of Jane Addams at Hull House and the Women's Trade Union League, and they hired Bessie Abramowitz as an organizer. In late 1914, garment workers in Chicago, New York, and other clothing centers split from the conservative United Garment Workers Union to form the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, and Bessie Abramowitz was elected to its general executive board. She became a leader in the campaign to draft Sidney Hillman to be the president of the new union, and he accepted. And during 1915, the young couple fought together again in an industry-wide strike for the union shop. The Amalgamated was an important union. It pioneered social programs like unemployment insurance for seasonal workers, vacations with pay, and retirement pensions. And later, during the Depression, Hillman and Abramowitz agitated for and helped to draft bills for unemployment compensation and fair labor standards on a federal level. But back in 1916, Bessie and Sidney, like a good union couple, announced their engagement publicly by marching arm in arm in the clothing workers contingent in the Chicago May Day Parade. They married a few days later. And they moved to New York, where they headquartered their new union. And interestingly, from then, 1916, until 1946, when Sidney Hillman died, all of Bessie's considerable union work was performed as an unpaid volunteer. At that point, once you were married, and you might still be very involved in the union, but you weren't going to be involved as a paid organizer anymore. She gave birth to 2 daughters. She continued to work with the Women's Trade Union League. She organized workers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, upstate New York, Connecticut, and elsewhere. In 1937, Hillman became the education director of the Laundry Workers Joint Board, and she really emphasized cultural programs and education opportunities. And in the Laundry Workers, which was a union with many workers of color, she became strongly involved in civil rights work, which became a dominant concern for the rest of her life. She continued to be active in the union's war efforts during the war. And then when Sidney Hillman died in 1946, leaving his family with virtually no money, the Amalgamated hired Bessie Hillman as a paid vice president in charge of the union's education program. And she went back to being an active paid worker, speaking at union conferences, organizing summer schools, urging the union to greater efforts for civil rights, peace, and economic justice. And she served in many different organizations, including being appointed to President John F. Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women in 1961. She remained very active in union activities until her death in December of 1970. I also want to tell you a little bit about Rose PESOTTA, who was known for her work out west. So this takes us further away from New York City. She was born in 1896 to a middle-class family in the Ukraine. She attended a school for girls with a Russian curriculum and had clandestine classes in Jewish history and Hebrew. But after a few years at the school, she was needed at home to help care for her siblings. And so her formal education was replaced with home tutoring. But it was also complemented by political training in the local anarchist underground, which she joined with her older sister. And she emigrated to America with her sister in 1913, again, to escape an arranged marriage. Once she was in the US, she started out in New York. She began working in various shirtwaist factories and joined Local 25 of the ILGWU. That was the local that LEMLICH had been leading, and it became a base for her union career. In 1915, she helped the local form the first education department in the ILGWU, and in 1920, she was elected to the local's executive board, and she played a key role in the union's chronic struggles with communists in the 1920s, and ultimately the union, who were very grateful for her contributions, appointed her an organizer in the late 20s. PESOTTA herself remained an anarchist, and like her good friend and fellow anarchist Emma Goldman, she was persecuted for her political beliefs and was arrested during the Red Scare of 1919 as an alien subversive. Unlike Goldman, she avoided deportation and was able to become an American citizen. And she really came into her own in her work in LA, where she worked mostly with Mexican workers. In 1933, she spearheaded the dressmakers' general strike in LA in the face of anti-picketing injunctions, hired thugs, and communist dual unions. She was able to mobilize the largely Mexican labor force through some new approaches that she innovated, like using Spanish language radio broadcasts and ads in ethnic newspapers, things that make a lot of sense, but were not things that were normally done then. So even though that strike was not successful, PESOTTA's leadership established her as one of the most gifted organizers of the union. And her visibility in California led her to be elected in 1934 as the vice president of the ILGWU, serving on the General Executive Board. She was the first woman to hold this high post. And throughout the 1930s and 40s, she was one of the most successful organizers in the US. She worked in places including Puerto Rico and Detroit and Cleveland, Buffalo, Boston, Salt Lake City, Los Angeles. She was involved with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and she joined their General Executive Board, but she refused in 1944 a fourth term on their executive board with the brief critical statement that, quote, one woman vice president could not adequately represent the women who now make up 85% of the International's membership of 305,000. And then following her resignation from the union office, she published 2 memoirs. She briefly worked for the NABRITH Anti-Defamation League, giving lectures about racism and anti-Semitism. But she supported herself during those years largely with faculty work, and she continued to do that really close up until her death in 1965. So I think her story is important because it reminds us that Jewish labor activists worked with diverse communities, and this often led to activism with other movements like the Civil Rights Movement. You know, the work of Rose PESOTTA and of BESSIE, ABRAMOWITZ, HILLMAN with workers of color just gave them a different insight into some of the other issues that were aligned with the labor movement as well in terms of civil rights issues. During the Depression, Jewish women began to organize in other arenas. Of course, in the 1920s, Jews had begun to enter school teaching, social work, retail sales, and office work. And though they weren't dominant in any of these arenas, they played prominent roles in the organizational battles of all of them in the 1930s. Sometimes these women were the daughters of unionists and often heirs to this Jewish tradition of labor activism and social justice. They were sometimes drawn to the vision that was then offered by the Communist Party, which conflicted with some of the traditional approaches of the unionists. You know, it worked for a wider variety of issues. Again, sort of like the younger women in an earlier generation who had fought for bread and roses, the communist unionists were often working for other policies like free lunch and policies for unemployment and ways to democratize schools and support progressive education. But this also could lead to a lot of conflict within unions during Red Scares when communists were often purged. And these kinds of involvements also disrupted some of the cross-class alliances that had been built with women's groups. And so we saw in those periods a lot of tension among some of the women who'd been involved in these different organizations around how much to support communist policies, how much to fight against the Red Scare. But by the end of World War II, there were 3 million women workers who belonged to unions, and 500,000 more would join union ranks in the 2 years that followed. Jewish women at that point were now a tiny minority, even within the unions that they had once deeply influenced. But they also found that the battleground for working women was shifting. So, you know, both inside and outside unions, women were joining together to extend some of the limited coverage of New Deal legislation beyond traditional manufacturing sectors to the areas where women were more likely to be working, like domestic work and public sector workers and retail clerks and part-time employees who had been left out of some of those policies. They began to shift into some of the fights that, you know, some of the issues that became the kind of central issues of the women's movement, issues like equal pay for equal work, and to push back against the barriers of occupational segregation. And this was another place where some of these younger women in the labor movement began to come into tension with some of the older labor activists, particularly around issues like protective labor legislation, which was something that Rose Schneiderman had fought for her whole life. But these younger activists wanted the equality of the Equal Rights Amendment, and that would undo some of the protective labor legislation. And so there were these very bitter fights. Schneiderman vacillated and sort of compromised on some of these issues, but her old friend Pauline Newman absolutely refused to budge, even though Newman's partner was supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment. So it was interesting to see some of those issues play out in a new generation. And the rise of African American women's involvement in the labor movement also strengthened the ties between labor issues and civil rights issues. So ultimately, we see some of the ways in which labor activism helped inform and strengthen and sometimes come into conflict with both the women's movement and the civil rights movement. But in so many of the social movements of that period, in the 60s and 70s and really up until today, we can see the roots and lessons of Jewish women in the labor movement, and sometimes even kind of direct generational legacies and heritages that are carried on. And I think it's really important that younger activists understand what they are building on, responding to, sometimes fighting against, when they are going out into the street and organizing as Jewish women. I look forward to answering some questions. I wanted to say a little bit about the Jewish Women's Archive. Much of the images and content that I've shared with you today can be found at the Jewish Women's Archive, which is a digital archive that exists to preserve Jewish women's history and to make sure that women's voices are included in the conversation. You can find all kinds of resources on our site, from online exhibits to lesson plans to an encyclopedia, a podcast, a blog. We're always looking at ways to tie the issues that or find the roots of the issues that matter to us today and understand their roots in history. So for example, you'll see there that we have some material on celebrating women's suffrage. We're celebrating the centennial and have all kinds of resources there from the archives to today, and connecting issues from across the decades and the generations of activists. We will have a forthcoming podcast episode on that topic as well. So I hope that you'll take the opportunity to visit jwa.org and delve into some of the very rich material that we have available on our site there. We're also running many online programs these days, since everyone is stuck at home. So we have our quarantine book talks, which happen weekly on Thursday nights, and we're also running some online history courses. We have a new course that is starting in August called Jewish Women You Thought You Knew or Never Knew. You can check out our events page at jwa.org/events to find out more information.
Thank you so much, Judith, for that really fascinating talk about Jewish women's labor activism and Jewish women's contributions to American social movements in general. And I can vouch that jwa.org is a rich and deep resource, and definitely recommend our listeners to check it out. Before we get to questions from you in the audience, and don't forget to write them into the question panel to the right of your screen, I do want to mention that the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center has another webinar coming up on August 25th. when we present Jews in the Catskills during and after the Holocaust, presented by Phil Brown, founder of the Catskills Institute, who gave another talk earlier this summer. Just as it was for this webinar, registration for the upcoming talk is free, and we hope you'll join us. Now let's turn to some of your questions. So I had a question that I wanted to start with, Judith. You showed a couple of the women you profiled with Eleanor Roosevelt, and I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about Roosevelt's involvement with their work and the sort of counsel that she had with these activists.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there are many points of connection, and and many of these Jewish women who had been labor activists for decades, by the time of the New Deal, they had been doing this work for so long and had such deep experience that was based on their own personal experience in factories, and then a lot of experience organizing and working on legislation, and Eleanor Roosevelt was really, in some ways, kind of a newcomer to some of these issues. I mean, she did not come from the world of working women and didn't really know the depth of the hardships that they faced. And so many of these women really helped open her eyes to some of the social issues that were so pressing at that time, and became part of FDR's inner circle, helping to shape New Deal legislation and really helped to shape the direction that Eleanor Roosevelt's life took for the rest of her career, working on so many issues of human rights, and I think also helped her build a community of women. Many of these women were really though they worked in a world that was very male-centered, they found for themselves and built a kind of family community of one another. And Roosevelt in some ways ended up building that for herself as well.
Excellent. Helen asks, and comments, "It is no surprise that Jewish women were leaders in the labor movement. So proud. However, what about the men? Were Jewish men also involved in the unions advocating for pay and hours and safety?"
Yes, absolutely. Jewish men played many important roles, and often had the kind of high-level jobs that women did not necessarily get until later, and they made up kind of the rank and file of the people who had started to build the union. They didn't always understand. They had a kind of traditional view of what unions could accomplish, and I think women workers helped them expand their view of what unions could offer beyond fighting for the kind of obvious pieces of pay and hours and a little bit about conditions, and women sort of built it and grew unions into really like full social service kinds of organizations. But absolutely, I mean, they were working most of the people who were leading the unions were men, and so they played really important roles, of course.
And you mentioned a number of times that the men were quite scornful and dismissive of these women's efforts. Was there a point when they acknowledged the successes and the achievements that the Jewish women activists had made, and did they begin to collaborate and join efforts?
They did. I mean, I think certainly success spoke to them. So when they saw that women organizers were able to mobilize tens of thousands of workers, that that showed them that maybe they should take these women seriously. But it took a long time. I mean, I think a lot of these women, like Pauline Newman, they were fighting the same battle for really a long time, and they were allowed some. They sort of would make inroads and begin to build a department of education or of of health, and really make the case for why these things were important and were going to help workers, help their families. And they often had to like keep kind of hammering that home. It wasn't an immediate it's not like a light bulb went off that quickly for a lot of the male organizers, but certainly there were some men who worked well with these women leaders, and appreciated the piece of work they were able to do. But it took in many cases, it never really became fully central. I mean, I think now we assume that unions provide some of those services, and also our sense of what the federal government, what federal government provides is also very different. But those were all things that the labor movement had to kind of bring to the fore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I especially appreciated the conclusion of your talk, where you were sort of talking about the through line of Jewish women's activism from labor to sort of evolving into getting involved in other issues and other social movements, and the interest in making social change writ large, and discovering commonalities along the way with other groups and other causes, and I think that's really instructive for our world today. We have a lot to learn from each other, and so it's a fascinating story, and women's activism, Jewish women's activism, continues, and so thank you so much for your instructive look at the past, which helps us reflect on the present. I do want to thank Judith Rosenbaum again. That's all the time we have for today, and thank all of you, especially in our audience, for joining us. As you leave the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a quick survey. If you do have further questions or want to learn more, you can contact us at jhcreference@nehgs.org. And as you leave, and we really appreciate it if you do fill out the survey, which gives us valuable feedback for further programming. And you can add any questions there as well that you might have that might be still unasked. I want to mention that this free webinar was made possible by contributions to the Jewish Heritage Center and New England Historic Genealogical Society. And we would be really grateful if you consider making a donation of your own to help us create more free programs. I invite you to learn more about the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center on our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. We hope to see you again on Tuesday, August 25th for the program on the Catskills. Until then, please stay healthy and enjoy the rest of your summer. Thank you.